I walked into the house, my mind still buzzing from my last college class of the day. The silence hit me immediately. Usually there'd be some sign of life, the hum of the TV, the clatter of dishes, or Serafina's voice on a work call. But today, nothing. I dropped my backpack by the door and kicked off my shoes. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. A faint sound caught my attention. It was barely there, like a whisper on the wind. Curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself moving towards the hallway. As I got closer to Serafina's room, the sound became clearer. My heart started to race, though I couldn't explain why. Something felt off. So I reached her door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of the room to be visible. The sound was unmistakable now, soft gasps and moans. My brain screamed at me to turn around, to walk away. This wasn't something I should be seeing. But my body refused to cooperate. I stood there, frozen, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the crack. And there she was. Serafina, my stepmother, lying on her bed. Her back was arched, her head thrown back in ecstasy. She was completely lost in her own world, oblivious to my presence. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as I stood there, unable to tear my gaze away from the scene before me. Serafina had always been beautiful, but this was something else entirely. The way her body moved, the soft sounds escaping her lips, it was intoxicating. But a voice in the back of my mind screamed that this was wrong. She was my stepmother, for Christ's sake. I should leave, forget I ever saw this. But I remained rooted to the spot, my eyes wide, drinking in every detail. The image burned itself into my brain. I knew, with a certainty that shook me to my core, that I would never be able to unsee this moment, never be able to look at Serafina the same way again. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the conflicting emotions surging through me. Shock, guilt, and something else, something I didn't want to name. In that moment, standing there in the hallway, my world shifted. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my family, about myself, it all came crashing down around me. I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding so loud I was sure Serafina could hear it. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to pretend I'd never seen anything. But as I started to back away, her eyes fluttered open, and suddenly I was pinned in place by her gaze. There was no shock in her expression, no embarrassment at being caught. Instead, her eyes held a warmth that seemed to reach out and wrap around me, drawing me in. But the corner of her mouth curved up in a soft smile, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Kian," she murmured, her voice low and inviting. "Come here." I knew I should leave. I knew this was wrong on so many levels, but my body wasn't listening to reason anymore. Feet carried me forward, across the threshold and into her room. The air felt thick, charged with an electricity that made my skin tingle. Serafina's eyes never left mine as I approached. There was something in them, a mixture of affection and desire that made my head spin. This was my stepmother, my dad's wife. But in that moment, all I could see was the most beautiful woman I'd ever known, looking at me like I was the only person in the world. I shouldn't be here, I managed to stammer out, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. She reached out a hand towards me. "But you are here, Kian, and I'm glad." The room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls themselves were pressing in on me. So I stood there, my entire body stiff and awkward. I didn't know what to do with my hands, my limbs, but her fingers curled around one of mine. They were soft, almost too soft, warm, too warm. Skin lit up under hers, heat spreading with every inch she touched. I froze as she pulled me a step closer, and I could feel the slightest sway of her breathing, calm and steady, completely at odds with the chaos blooming inside me. I should have stepped back. I knew that. My mind kept screaming it in the back of my skull, but something else had taken over, this low hum of anticipation buzzing beneath the guilt. I didn't want to listen to reason, not now. Not with the way she looked at me, her lips parted like an invitation. But it was intoxicating. Hell, it was more than that. It was like falling, slow and inevitable, into something that felt like it could tear me apart, but I couldn't pull away from. She guided my hand down, over the soft fabric of her dress. Her heartbeat was steady under my palm, her breath so damn close. My own stumbled, catching in my throat. I felt like I was drowning, swallowed up by something much bigger than me, something I'd never expected. But here we were, and my body's reactions were betraying me, pushing me closer into that pull even as my head warned me to turn away. Her skin was smooth through her clothes, and I could feel the rise and fall of her chest under my hesitant touch. Everything from her movements to her whispers seemed calculated, like she'd already mapped out the exact steps, knowing exactly where this would go. She leaned in, and I should have shut it down then, but I didn't. When she whispered for me to relax, her voice was soft, velvety, like she was offering comfort, even as she led me straight into a place I couldn't escape. I couldn't process everything at once. My stomach twisted in knots, guilt slamming into me in sharp waves. Beneath it was excitement. A raw, reckless kind I hadn't felt before, and it was that feeling that finally silenced any logic still clawing at me to stop. Her fingers tighten around mine as she pulls me closer. My heart hammers against my chest, every beat pounding in my ears, drowning out the rational thoughts that should be telling me to stop this, to turn away. It is this buzzing between us, this invisible pull I can't shake. Her face is inches from mine now, and I can feel the warmth of her breath against my skin. It's intimate. Too intimate. Like we've crossed some boundary in this silent, shared moment, and nothing will ever be the same. So I swallow hard, frozen in place, not sure whether to step back or lean in. But she doesn't give me a choice. Serafina's hand slides up my arm, her touch feather light but insistent, guiding me until the space between us vanishes completely. There's this long, charged pause where time itself seems to hold its breath, and for a split second, I think she's going to pull away. But then I feel it. Her lips brush against mine, tentative at first, almost as if she's testing the waters, waiting to see if I'll resist. But I don't. Can't. The kiss starts slow, cautious, like we're both still unsure if this is real, if this is actually happening. Then something shifts, changes. The tension that had been building for God knows how long snaps like a rubber band stretched too tight. The kiss deepens, taking on a gravity of its own, like we're being dragged under by it. Her lips move against mine, soft yet commanding, and I'm hit with this wave of, I don't even know what. It's like a million different emotions crashing at once. Guilt, desire, confusion, but all of them seem to drown in the fire spreading through my chest. I don't even know when my hands slipped her waist, but they're there now, gripping her hips. Serafina trembles under my touch, and every slight movement of her body sends sparks up my spine. Her fingers thread through my hair, pulling me closer still, and we both sink deeper into this strange, forbidden world that, in this moment, feels more right than wrong. Each kiss feels like it's pulling me further away from who I thought I was. Her breath is soft against my chest, warm, steady, almost hypnotic in its rhythm. I'm staring at the ceiling, fingers still numb from the intensity of it all, the echo of our closeness lingering in my limbs. My body feels weightless, suspended in this fragile moment between what just happened and the avalanche I know is waiting. But right now, it's just us, tangled sheets and silence. Like we've made some kind of quiet bubble and blocked off the rest of the world. Maybe it's self-defense. Blocking out everything else is easier. Serafina's hair drapes over my shoulder, a cascade of auburn strands that cling to my skin. Her arms flung over my chest, her fingers drawing those absent patterns like she's trying to keep herself anchored in this too. I can't tell if she's awake or drifting off. I don't dare move or breathe too hard, scared that if I do, this moment will all unravel. We don't speak, but the weight of it, it's thick. Like it's settling over both of us, pressing down until it's all I can think about. What the hell have I done? But the minute my mind even dares inch closer to that question, I shove it away, deep down. I'm not ready for whatever the answer might be. There's an instinct to not name this, to not turn this feeling over in my hands too much. It's as if not speaking about it might keep the reality at bay for a moment longer. Serafina shifts, her head nestling further into me, and my arm tightens around her like this reflex I didn't plan on. That strange, familiar mix burns in me again, guilt sloshing around with something else. Something slower. Heavier. It doesn't feel wrong in this second, though I know logically it should. So I close my eyes briefly, and the memory flashes back. Her lips on mine. The way her fingers grip me tighter, both of us fumbling in the heat of it all. The line we'd crossed, it was so clear. But we didn't care. We didn't think. Her skin against mine, the heat. But everything else had disappeared in the wave, the pure physicality of it all, and I'd let myself dissolve into it. Reality though, yeah, it's starting to creep back in. That evening, When Rees, my father, finally came home, I felt the guilt hit me full force. It was like walking into a thick wall I hadn't seen coming. Every muscle in my body tensed as I heard the front door creak open. I was in the kitchen, trying to focus on something other than the mess I had just made of. Well, everything. The sink rattled as I dried the dishes with too much pressure, knuckles turning white around the towel. The plate in front of me clattered slightly as I placed it on the rack, the noise louder than I meant. Rees strolled in, radiating this weird sense of calm he carried after a long day at work. His tie loosened, shoes clicking with his familiar rhythm. He looked at me, oblivious. My heart thudded harder. "Hey, bud, how was the day?" The question was as casual as ever, but it sank into me like a dagger. He smiled that tired but warm dad smile that never failed to remind me I was his son, and my gut tightened, so I couldn't force a reply beyond nodding. And that silence stretched on, thicker than it should have been. For a heartbeat, I was sure he could see it in my eyes, the mess inside me. But then Riss moved on, strolling over to the fridge like nothing was wrong. Serafina floated into the room right after. Her footsteps were soft, measured, like she'd rehearsed them. She was collected, not a single hair out of place from earlier. It was almost eerie, the way she locked eyes with Riss on instinct, her entire vibe shifting just by his presence. There was a quick glance toward me, brief. So fleeting it would have slipped by unnoticed if I weren't bracing for it. But she made sure she didn't let it linger too long. Her lips curled in that same perfect smile she gave him as if everything was just normal. Riss kissed her on the forehead, muttering something dumb about work, probably while my mind was whirling. I watched as Serafina melded into her role effortlessly. She kept the chatter up, smoothly handling their conversation. I saw her draw invisible lines between them, lines she hadn't needed before. Like she was right in front of him, but she pulled back just the tiniest bit when his hand got too close, or she timed things so there was never much physical contact. Nothing obvious, nothing Rees would ever pick up on, but I noticed. As for me, I couldn't even sit still. Every word my father said made my insides twist. There was this sickening clash between hearing him genuinely express how much he adored her, and the fact that I'd been wrapped up in his wife's sheets just hours ago. The house wasn't big enough for what was hanging in the air, for the secret I'd helped create. For the rest of the night, I avoided his eyes like my life depended on it, doubting whether I could hold myself together if we connected for more than a second. At the dinner table, I didn't look up once. My throat felt narrow every time Riss asked about school or my friends, but I gave mechanical answers, one-word responses, praying he wouldn't dig deeper. He wasn't the type who did, thankfully. Instead, he turned to Serafina, and their talk filled the space. She leaned into that role, supportive, engaging, but there were moments, small ones, where our shared glance flickered for just a beat too long. I pretended to focus on my plate, but inside I was coming apart. The days that followed? They didn't offer any kind of reprieve. If anything, it got worse. Serafina started testing the waters. At first, it was subtle. I'd pass her in the hallway and her fingertips would brush lightly across my arm. Not long, not obvious, but enough to send shivers right through me. It was like she wanted to remind me, in every small way, of what we had done. Her glances became more intense, her touches bolder. I knew it was only a matter of time before this whole thing broke open, but still, I couldn't say no, not to her. In those moments where it was just us, it was like time slowed, and I felt that pull all over again. One afternoon, Riss was out back grilling. The sun was beaming down, and the smell of charcoal hung heavy in the air. Serafina stepped inside to grab something from the kitchen. In reality, I think she was seeking me out. As I stood by the counter, pretending to scroll through my phone, I felt her presence before I saw her. She bumped her hip against mine, playful, but damn if it didn't send my pulse skyrocketing. Then suddenly she pressed her body against mine, her breath soft on my neck. It didn't matter that Riss was just 50 feet away in the yard. I could hear his distant humming through the open window, but that didn't stop her from whispering in my ear, her voice low and so damn confident. I froze. Guilt knifed into me, but that didn't stop the surge of heat running through my veins. I couldn't control how my body reacted to her anymore. She had a grip on me I was afraid I'd never shake off. This went on, small touches, fleeting moments stolen away when no one was looking. Sometimes it was in the kitchen, other times in the dim hallway between our bedrooms, where Riss couldn't see. Each time Serafina's hand would land on me, linger a little longer than necessary as she passed by. No hesitation. Smooth. Effortless. Meanwhile, I was walking a tightrope, trying not to look too guilty when my father asked if everything was okay or commented on how Serafina's really a calming presence in the house. It made me want to scream, to tear apart the walls around me, but something always stopped me. She developed this silent, secret routine. She would glance at me, just a flash of something wicked in her eyes at times when I least expected it, pulling me into her orbit. At night, when Riss had passed out on the couch or gone upstairs early, we'd steal moments in the dark corners near the stairwell. Her fingers would slide up my arm. Sometimes only that, other times more. Each interaction was a dance. We were threading a needle through some invisible line, hoping it wouldn't snap. And Riz? He kept telling me how lucky we were to have Serafina in our lives, thanking her during dinner for all the small things she did around the house. Each compliment, each word of gratitude felt like another stone tied to my ankle, dragging me further down into this mess. But it wasn't just the weight of my own lies anymore. It was knowing how much my father trusted her, adored her, even because of me. In a sense, it crushed me. I tried to distance myself. I told myself I'd stop, that it wasn't worth it. But I couldn't. Serafina had a way of pulling me back in, whether it was a look, a touch, or that goddamn smile. Every time I swore it was the last, she'd find a way to slip back under my skin. That night felt like walking a tightrope spun between regret and desire. Jace had come over, as casual as ever, tossing a six-pack on the counter and cracking jokes about his week. Everything should have felt normal, but nothing did. I couldn't stop feeling jittery, checking to make sure Serafina wasn't making any moves that would raise suspicion. So the suffocating weight of keeping this secret around Jace, it was too much. And then it almost all came crashing down. So we were lounging in the living room, me half paying attention to whatever show Jace was going on about, when Serafina wandered in. She looked too casual, too comfortable. My heart thundered in my chest when she leaned over the back of the couch, her fingers brushing the side of my arm just a bit too lightly. A small touch, but it set me on edge. Jace had to step out for a second to take a call, and I saw my chance to take a breath. Serafina, though, had other ideas. She leaned closer, her fingers now deliberately grazing my thigh. It was reckless. Insane, even. Just when I was about to pull away, just to make it stop, Jace's footsteps echoed through the hallway. Joel had seconds to respond. Serafina, realizing he was close, straightened herself with a fluid grace that made me feel cold inside. Jace walked back in, completely oblivious. We dodged the bullet, but something inside me snapped right then. As soon as Jace left, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I stormed into her room, slamming the door behind me without caring how it echoed through the walls. What the hell were you thinking? My voice came out sharper than I intended, like I'd been holding the anger in for too long. She barely flinched, her face still calm, as though it were all no big deal. Relax, Kian. He didn't notice anything. That's not the point, I growled. We almost got caught, Serafina. If Jace had seen. What? If Jace had seen us, what? Would that have been so terrible? Her voice was rising, a tension in it that I hadn't heard before. Her eyes were fixed on mine, challenging. I opened my mouth to fire back, but the words got caught somewhere between my rage and my confusion. Yes, it would have been a fucking disaster. "'Twere not a dirty little secret, Kian," she spat out, her patience unraveling. "You're the one making us into something shameful. You don't get it." I shot back. You didn't see the look on his face. If he knew, if anyone knew, it would ruin everything. My dad. She was getting louder now. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. It's always about Reese, isn't it? About keeping this perfect little lie intact. You want me when it's easy for you, but the second there's any real risk, I'm the mistake you want to erase. That's not what this is, I yelled, matching her intensity now, the words blurring together like a dam bursting. You act like this is simple, but it's not. This, what we're doing, it's wrong. It's fucked up. And yet you keep coming back, don't you? Every time. You still want this, she accused, her voice cracking. You just don't want to admit it because you can't stand being a hypocrite. Her words hit like knives ripping across skin. I felt my chest tighten, the guilt twisting into something ugly. She wasn't wrong, and that made it worse. But there was no way I was letting her win this. I took one last look at her face now streaked with anger and tears, and I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket off the chair and bolted, slamming the door behind me as if shutting out the entire mess would make it easier to breathe. So I drove without thinking. The streets a blur beneath me. Just miles of black pavement and the hum of the engine to drown out the storm inside my head. I didn't know where I was driving to that night. I just needed to get away. My hands felt numb on the steering wheel, the road blurring beneath my wheels as the city lights smeared into the night. The argument with Serafina. I couldn't even remember how it escalated so fast. So one minute it was Jace almost figuring us out, then suddenly we were spitting accusations at each other. Her words kept cutting through my head on repeat like a bad song you can't shake. Do you only come to me when it suits you? She wasn't wrong. I hated how much I wanted her, even after everything. The guilt ate at me every damn second, especially whenever I looked at my father, but at the same time, Serafina was like this addictive pull I couldn't escape. Sober and clear-headed. I knew it was messed up, but with her tangled up in the sheets or even just standing close, the lines blurred too easily, and I crossed them over and over. I don't know how long I drove for, maybe hours. At some point I found myself on some deserted road, parked staring at the empty stretch of asphalt from the driver's seat. Maybe I hoped that getting away would make everything simpler, clearer, but none of it did. Eventually I turned back towards home. The house was lit dimly as I pulled into the driveway, past midnight by now. So I slipped inside quietly. The air had that unsettling stillness like it does in the middle of the night, the kind where your own breath feels too loud, so I didn't expect to find her there. But Serafina sat curled up on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest. She was staring at the floor, and under her eyes, her mascara had smudged from crying. We didn't say anything for a second. Her gaze lifted, puffy and red around the edges, locking on me from across the room, and just like that, my resolve broke. Without thinking, my feet carried me forward, closing the space between us. She rose, meeting me halfway, her hand brushing against my cheek. Her touch was trembling but still familiar. Neither of us spoke, and God, I didn't have the words even if I wanted to. Instead, I pulled her in, holding her too tight, feeling her press herself into me, fist clutching at my t-shirt like she was afraid I'd slip away again. There we were, still caught in this fucking mess, but in that moment none of it mattered. The fight, the anger, the accusations, it all washed away like the tide pulling back to leave nothing but the cool sand. I could feel her heartbeat against me, fast but soothing, like some wordless apology that I couldn't help but accept. She buried her face into my chest, shaking slightly. I thought you weren't coming back. Her voice sounded so small right then, so different from how she usually was. The confident, teasing Serafina that always seemed in control. But it hit me in a way I didn't expect, and I felt my own throat tighten. I'm here. And it was true. No matter how fucked up or wrong it felt, I hadn't left, not really. I always came back. Her skin was warm against mine as we stood there, the room fading away around us. For that brief moment, nothing else mattered. It was just her. Just us. Serafina pulled back slightly, looking up at me, her eyes searching for something, maybe reassurance, maybe guilt. But I don't know. But when I cupped her face, wiping away the black streaks on her cheeks with my thumb, she leaned into my palm like she needed that comfort more than she'd ever admit. I can't lose you, Kian. Her voice cracked halfway and I felt the weight of her words settle between us. It wasn't just about attraction anymore. It hadn't been for a while. But hearing her say it made everything that much more real. Swallowed hard, a knot forming in my stomach. As wrong as it all was, I realized in that moment how much losing her would gut me, how deep I'd let myself get into this. You won't. I'm not going anywhere, I whispered, though my chest felt heavy with the weight of what that actually meant. She nodded. Slowly, but the worry didn't leave her eyes completely. Her lips brushed against mine, a slow, tentative kiss filled with something strange and soft, almost terrifying in its sincerity. When we pulled apart, we stayed quiet, holding each other, too many thoughts racing through my mind. The words hadn't been much, but that embrace, that kiss, it said more than either of us could bring ourselves to admit. But over time, the distance with my dad grew gradually, like a slow tear that nobody bothers to fix. It wasn't like he was around much anyway, always deep into his work. But when he was, whenever he sat at the dinner table, the silence stretched too long, every second thick with what was unspoken. He asked me about school, about whatever shallow things fathers ask about, but each time I answered, it felt mechanical, half-hearted. I kept catching myself avoiding eye contact, avoiding him entirely. I could feel Serafina's gaze on me too. Neutral. Concerned wife mode kicked in whenever he asked her if she'd noticed anything wrong. She always shrugged it off effortlessly, saying something about me being busy, about how college was a lot for a 19-year-old. At times like those, I could almost hate her for how quickly she shifted into that role. And then I'd glance at her, and the coil of heat and guilt would twist all over again inside me, reminding me that I'd chosen this. Reese kept the questions coming, though. I could see it in the way his brows furrowed lately, how he lingered longer on me at the dinner table, trying to figure out what was going through my head. Part of me wanted to scream at him just to look closer, just to notice already, but that wasn't going to happen. I was safe as long as everyone played their part. That night, after everyone else in the house had drifted into an uneasy sleep, Serafina slipped into my room again. This time it wasn't rushed, wasn't heated. The way she moved, sliding in beside me, was soft, careful. Her fingers traced my skin. "It's not just desire anymore," she whispered, words almost breaking the calm of the night. So I stayed still, feeling her body close. The air between us crackled differently this time, like something more fragile was at stake now. "I'm falling in love with you, Kian." I didn't know how long it would take before I answered, though the truth had already settled. God, part of me was waiting for a moment like this. Maybe too much of me had wanted this. Yeah, I met her gaze, searching her face, trying to decide if I should say it back, if admitting it sealed the last line we hadn't crossed yet. I let out a shaky breath. "I feel it too." Ah. Just like that, we both knew there was no walking this back, no more pretending it was anything simpler. It was getting harder to breathe with every passing day, like I was suffocating under the weight of our secret. Even when I wasn't with Serafina, it felt like her presence haunted every room of the house. I'd catch a glimpse of her in the way the light filtered through the curtains or in the mess of blankets on my bed. For a while, it had been thrilling, the secrecy, the racing heart, the idea that every stolen moment was precious because it was forbidden. But now I was just tired. Tired of hiding, tired of living this lie, tired of the guilt gnawing at my insides every damn day. The anniversary of that first night was coming up soon. A full year since I'd walked into a room, half out of confusion, half out of desire, and let everything fall apart from there. It had been this wild, reckless year where nothing made sense except for what was happening between us. And even that didn't make a whole lot of sense anymore. Sure, Serafina and I were still connected. Hell, probably even more so now, but it wasn't fun anymore. It was suffocating, being locked into a cycle of stolen glances, hurried whispers, and waiting until my father left the house so we could be together. I think Serafina felt it too. That heaviness. Whenever we were alone, you could see it in how her fingers lingered on mine like she was holding on for dear life. She wasn't as carefree as she used to be, wasn't throwing out casual jokes about our situation or teasing me with flirtatious comments. And instead, her eyes would darken when we kissed, like she was trying to pull something out of me, something I wasn't sure I even had anymore. One evening, after a particularly stressful day of avoiding Reese, Serafina brought it up. She was sitting on the edge of my bed, her long auburn hair falling over her shoulders, lips pursed like she'd been carrying this thought for way too long. "We can't keep doing this, Kian," she said, her voice low but firm, and it wasn't a suggestion, it was a declaration. So I knew what she meant. Even before I opened my mouth to respond, we were backed into a corner, living in this strange, twisted relationship where we couldn't move forward. So we were stuck, both of us pretending like everything was fine when nothing was fine. Going public. Telling Riss. That was something I hadn't dared to seriously entertain. I mean, how do you even begin to tell your father that you've been sleeping with his wife? But Serafina, she'd already made up her mind. Her eyes said it all. She was tired of sneaking around just as much as I was, and maybe even more. She was ready, even though the fallout would be nuclear. And every part of me screamed to leave things the way they were. Not to stir the shitstorm. My gaze flicked away from hers, landing on the worn-out sneakers by the door, my body rigid with the tension of knowing what had to happen next. I don't know if I can do this," I managed to get out. She didn't push me, not immediately. Her hand found mine like it always had, her skin warm against my cold fingers. She wasn't angry, just determined. She slid closer until our knees were touching, and without a word, I knew that she wouldn't back down from this. She was done waiting. So we made a plan. A stupid, insane, reckless plot. It was the only thing we could think of. She didn't sleep that night, not even for a second. The entire time I'd thought about when where sit my dad down and break him in half. But it wasn't just risk his trust we'd destroy, it'd be his whole life. And for what? So Serafina and I could stop sneaking around. So we didn't have to pretend anymore. But pretending was killing us too. Slowly, quietly, it was pulling us apart bit by bit, and I wasn't sure how many more pieces I had left to lose. The day came faster than I expected. Looking back, it feels like a blur. A rapid descent into this nightmare that neither Serafina nor I could stop from unfolding. Riz was home. A rarity these days, his work keeping him in the office long after the sun had set. But the timing felt right, or maybe necessary, inevitable. All I knew was we couldn't keep living on borrowed time. The three of us sat around the living room, the TV softly humming in the background while Serafina's fingers were doing this nervous tapping against her knee. I could barely look at her, or my father for that matter. The sweat on my palms felt like water pooling, flooding my skin, laughter from whatever stupid sitcom was on TV mocking the stillness hanging between us. Briss, as always, had no idea what was about to crash into his world. He distracted, scrolling on his phone. The guy probably thought everything was perfect, or as perfect as it could be. Serafina was at his side, his son under the same roof, at the family in name alone. Serafina spoke first. She always had the guts I couldn't muster. Her voice came out calm, measured. Too calm. Almost eerie given the bomb she was about to drop. "We need to talk," she said. And right away, just from the way those words fell, Riz frowned and set his phone to the side. It was the kind of line that could never mean anything good. His brows knitted together, gaze shifting between her and me, like he was trying to solve the puzzle before we even opened our mouths. But there was no time for puzzles. This wasn't something he could figure out on his own. For a moment, no one said anything, and I just sat there, frozen, heart hammering like a kicked drum. My throat felt like it was closing up, like if I opened my mouth I'd choke on the truth. Kian and I, Serafina started, and I prayed to every god I didn't believe in that the words wouldn't leave her mouth, that she'd change her mind, take it back, rewind time. Anything but what was coming next. Riz still looked confused, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at me. "Christ, I'm so sorry," I murmured. Before she could finish, it came out pitiful, messy, the key apology too big to ever be enough, but I had to say it. It was a knee-jerk reaction, something I couldn't hold down any longer. The words rushed out after that, neither of us able to stop the flood. Serafina's filled the silence I left. My father didn't interrupt, didn't speak a word. He just sat there, eyes glazing over as we confessed everything. His jaw tightened, eyes wide and bloodshot by the time we finished, and the silence that followed was the worst. The kind that made you wish for screaming, for anything just to break the choking tension. Riz stood up without a word, turned on his heel, and left the room, his hands clenched by his sides, his breath shuddering out in a way that felt like a seismic crack had just ripped through him. He didn't slam doors or yell. He didn't need to. The quiet was enough. Serafina's hand reached for mine, gripping it tight as the weight sunk in, and for the first time in months I felt lighter in the worst way. The days after that felt like a repeat of the same nightmare. Riz didn't come back that night. We heard him moving around upstairs later on, but instead of confronting us, he just grabbed a suitcase and left. After that, he barely spoke to either of us. Serafina always tried to act like we'd made the right choice, but I could see the hollowness in her too. The house felt emptier, colder. It was amazing how much of the life had drained out of it. We had each other, sure, but everything else was falling apart. The thrill was gone. The sneaking around, the excitement, all of that had been stripped down to the bone. Now it was just the two of us sitting in this mess we created. Riz moved out a week later, officially this time. The silence that followed was unbearable. I'd lay awake at night, hearing nothing but the echo of what once was. He didn't yell or scream when he left. He just packed and left, as if the life we had meant nothing, as if we'd already burned everything beyond repair. And maybe we had. Serafina tried to be there for me, clinging to this idea that it'd get easier, that we had each other and things would work out, but it wasn't easy. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed the story, remember to like, subscribe, and comment on the video for more stories like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. If you have any similar stories to share, leave them in the comments and we'll make sure to bring them to life. Thanks for watching.